the scream that tore from Eleanor Jameson's throat as the bridge beneath her wagon splintered and collapsed into the churning rapids below, was swallowed by the roar of the swollen river. And in that singular, terrifying moment, she understood how quickly everything could change. She clung to the wagon seat as her horses reared and panicked, their hooves finding purchase on the muddy bank just in time. But the bridge itself, a sturdy wooden structure that had stood for 15 years according to the locals, was gone, devoured by spring runoff that had transformed the peaceful crossing into a raging monster. The wagon jerked backward as the horses scrambled, and Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized she was stranded on the wrong side of the river, miles from Salt Lake City, Utah, with no way across and darkness falling fast. It was May of 1882, and Eleanor had been traveling alone from her aunt's homestead back to the city where she worked as a school teacher, a journey she had made dozens of times before without incident. But 3 days of unseasonable rain had swollen every creek and river in the territory, and what should have been a simple crossing had become impossible. She climbed down from the wagon on shaking legs, staring at the churning water where the bridge had been just moments before. Debris rushed past in the current, including what looked like pieces of the bridge itself, spinning and tumbling in the muddy torrent. Miss, are you hurt?" The voice came from across the river, masculine and urgent, and Eleanor looked up to see a man on horseback on the opposite bank. He was tall in the saddle, wearing the rough clothes of a working cowboy, his hat pulled low against the misting rain that had started to fall again. "I am unharmed," she called back, cupping her hands around her mouth to be heard over the water. "But the bridge is gone. I can see that." He dismounted, moving closer to the edge to assess the situation. Even from across the 20-foot span of violent water, Eleanor could see he was young, probably close to her own age of 23, with broad shoulders and the confident stance of someone who spent his days working hard under the sun. "You cannot stay there. There is another storm coming, and this whole area will flood." Eleanor felt a spike of fear. She looked around at the landscape surrounding her, all of it low and flat near the riverbank. If the water rose much more, she would indeed be in danger. "What should I do?" The cowboy was silent for a moment, studying the river with an intensity that suggested he was calculating something dangerous. Then he called back, "There is a shallow crossing about a mile upstream. Can you ride?" "Yes." Eleanor had grown up around horses, though she had not ridden in some time. "Unhitch one of your horses and ride upstream. Follow the river north, and you will see me. The crossing there is not deep, but you must hurry before it becomes impassable too." Eleanor did not waste time. She quickly unhitched the steadier of her two horses, a bay mare named Rosie, and swung herself up onto the animal's back without bothering with a saddle. Her skirts bunched awkwardly around her legs, but modesty was the least of her concerns now. She urged Rosie forward, following the riverbank as it curved northward through increasingly rough terrain. The rain was falling harder now, cold drops that soaked through her traveling coat and made her shiver. She had gone perhaps 3/4 of a mile when she saw the cowboy again, his own horse picking its way along the opposite bank. He pointed ahead, and Eleanor saw where he meant, a wider section of river where the water spread out and appeared, if not exactly shallow, at least less violent. But as she drew closer, her hope died. Even here the water was running fast and deep, easily up to a horse's chest, probably higher in the middle. The spring runoff had made every crossing treacherous. "It is too deep," she called across to him. "I cannot make it." The cowboy sat still for a moment on his horse, and Eleanor could almost see him thinking. Then, to her shock, he began removing his gun belt and outer clothes, stripping down to just his trousers and undershirt. "Wait there," he commanded, and before she could ask what he intended, he urged his horse into the water. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat as she watched horse and rider enter the current. The water was stronger than it looked, and within seconds it was up to the horse's shoulders, rushing past with enough force to make the animal struggle. The cowboy leaned forward, talking to his mount, encouraging it, and slowly, agonizingly, they made progress across. Twice the horse stumbled, and Eleanor was certain they would both be swept away. But somehow they made it, emerging on her side of the river with water streaming from both man and beast. "You are insane," Eleanor said, torn between relief and anger at the risk he had taken. "You could have drowned." "We do not have time to debate it," he said, breathing hard. his dark hair plastered to his head. Now that he was closer, she could see him properly. He was perhaps 25, with strong features tanned dark from outdoor work, and gray eyes that were currently fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "The water is rising by the minute. We need to get you across now, while it is still possible." "But how? You said yourself it is too deep for a horse with a rider." "It is too deep for a horse carrying a rider who is sitting up high," he agreed. He dismounted, his boots squelching in the mud. "But if you are lower, closer to the horse's center of gravity, we can make it. I am going to carry you across on my back." Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" "You will climb on my back, hold tight around my shoulders, and I will walk you across. I know this river. I know where the bottom is solid and where it is not. We can make it, but you have to trust me." "I do not even know your name." "It is Henry Fletcher. And yours?" "Eleanor Jameson." She looked at the raging water, then back at this stranger who was proposing something completely improper and possibly suicidal. "This is madness." "It is survival, Miss Jameson. Now we can stand here debating propriety while the river rises, or you can climb on my back and let me get you to safety. What will it be?" Eleanor had always prided herself on being practical. She had left her family home in Illinois 3 years ago to make her own way in the world, had crossed half the continent to take a teaching position in Utah Territory, and had lived independently ever since. She was not some helpless flower who fainted at the first sign of difficulty. And right now, this cowboy, this Henry Fletcher, was offering her the only chance she had of getting across this river before nightfall. "All right," she said, dismounting from Rosie. "But if we die, I am going to be very angry with you." The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the start of a smile. "Duly noted. Leave your horse. She will be fine here, and someone can come back for her in your wagon once the water recedes. Hitch her to something so she does not wander." Eleanor quickly secured Rosie to a sturdy tree, then returned to where Henry waited. He had waded a few steps into the water, testing the current. "Come here," he said, crouching down. "Climb on my back, wrap your arms around my shoulders, and lock your hands together in front of my chest. Wrap your legs around my waist. I know it is not proper, but you need to hold on tight. If you fall off in that current, I might not be able to catch you." Eleanor felt her face flame at the impropriety of what he was describing, but she pushed her embarrassment aside. Henry was right. This was about survival, not social niceties. She stepped up behind him and carefully climbed onto his back, wrapping her arms around his shoulders as instructed. He was solid and warm beneath her, all muscle from years of physical labor. And despite the cold rain and her fear, she felt an unexpected sense of security as he straightened, taking her weight easily. "Lock your hands," he reminded her, and she clasped her fingers together in front of his chest. "Legs around my waist. Good. Now, do not let go, no matter what happens. Understand?" "I understand. If I tell you to take a breath, you take the deepest breath you can and hold it. The water might go over our heads in the deepest part." Eleanor's heart hammered. "Henry." "Trust me, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the way he said it, steady and sure, gave her courage. "I trust you." He began walking into the water. The current hit them immediately, strong and cold, and Eleanor gasped as it soaked through her skirts. Henry's pace was slow and deliberate, each step carefully placed. The water rose quickly to his thighs, then his waist. Eleanor felt the power of it pushing against them, trying to sweep them downstream, but Henry kept moving forward, his body angled slightly against the current. His muscles were taut beneath her, every ounce of his strength focused on keeping them upright and moving. "You are doing fine," he said, his voice strained with effort. "Keep holding tight." The water reached his chest, and Eleanor felt it rise to her own waist, where she clung to his back. It was shockingly cold, and she could feel the current tugging at her skirts, trying to pull her loose. She tightened her grip, pressing herself against Henry's back. He kept walking, step by agonizing step, and Eleanor realized she was praying under her breath, words she had not spoken since she was a child. They were perhaps halfway across when Henry's foot slipped. Eleanor felt him lurch sideways, and she screamed, certain they were going under. But Henry caught himself somehow, his arms windmilling for balance, and after a heart-stopping moment, he steadied. "I have you," he gasped. "I have you. Just hold on." "Take your time," Eleanor managed, though her voice was shaking. She could feel his heart pounding beneath her clasped hands, could feel the tremor of exhaustion in his muscles. He had already crossed this river once, and now he was doing it again, carrying her weight on his back. The strength and courage that required made her throat tight with emotion. Henry kept going. The water deepened further, rising to his shoulders, and Eleanor felt it climbing up her back. "Deep breath," Henry commanded, and Eleanor sucked in air just as the water closed over their heads. Everything became a chaos of cold and pressure and the sound of rushing water. Eleanor kept her eyes squeezed shut, her lungs burning, her arms locked around Henry's shoulders with every ounce of strength she possessed. She could feel him still walking beneath her, still fighting forward, and she held on because that was the only thing she could do. Then they broke the surface, both of them gasping for air. The water was receding, now only to Henry's chest, then his waist. He was moving faster now, sensing safety. And within moments, his feet were on solid ground, and he was stumbling up the far bank, Eleanor still clinging to his back. He made it to dry ground before his legs gave out, and he sank to his knees in the mud, breathing in great heaving gasps. Eleanor slid off his back and collapsed beside him, shaking violently from cold and shock and relief. For a long moment, neither of them could speak. They simply knelt there in the rain, alive. Then Eleanor turned to look at Henry, at this man who had risked his life twice to save her, a complete stranger, and she felt something crack open in her chest, something warm and overwhelming. "You saved my life," she whispered. Henry turned to meet her eyes, rain streaming down his face, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "I was not about to let you drown, Miss Jameson. Eleanor, please, call me Eleanor. Eleanor." He said it again, softer this time, and the way her name sounded in his voice made something flutter in her stomach. They stared at each other for a moment that seemed to stretch, and Eleanor became acutely aware of how close they were, how alone they were out here, how her hands had somehow found their way to his arms. A crack of thunder broke the moment, and Henry pushed to his feet, offering her his hand. "We need to get out of this rain and get you warm. Can you ride double?" "Yes." Eleanor let him pull her up, and she was surprised by how steady his hand felt, how reluctant she was to let go once she was standing. Henry whistled, and his horse, which had been grazing a short distance away, trotted over. Henry mounted first, then reached down to pull Eleanor up behind him. She settled onto the horse's back, her arms wrapping around Henry's waist, and tried not to think about how improper this was, how scandalous it would look if anyone saw them. But there was no one out here to see, just empty land and angry sky. "There is a line shack about 2 miles west," Henry said over his shoulder as he urged the horse into a trot. "It is not much, but it will be dry, and there is a stove. We can warm up there and wait out the storm." Eleanor simply nodded, pressing herself against his back for warmth. She was so cold her teeth were chattering, and her wet clothes clung to her body uncomfortably. But she was alive, and that was more than she had expected 15 minutes ago. She let her cheek rest against Henry's shoulder blade, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, and allowed herself to feel safe for the first time since the bridge had collapsed. The ride to the line shack passed in a blur of rain and gathering darkness. Eleanor was so cold and exhausted that she was barely aware of her surroundings, just the steady motion of the horse and the solid warmth of Henry in front of her. When they finally stopped, she looked up to see a small wooden structure, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it looked like heaven. Henry dismounted and helped her down, his hands steadying her when her legs nearly buckled. "Easy," he murmured. "You are all right. Let me get you inside." He led his horse to a lean-to attached to the side of the shack, quickly untacked the animal and made sure it was secure, then guided Eleanor to the door. Inside, the shack was sparse but functional. There was a small iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bunk against one wall, and some shelves with basic supplies. Most importantly, it was dry. Henry immediately set about building a fire in the stove, and within minutes, warm light was flickering through the small space. Eleanor stood shivering near the door, her arms wrapped around herself, unable to stop trembling. "Eleanor, you need to get out of those wet clothes," Henry said, not looking at her as he fed more wood into the stove. "There are some blankets in the chest there, and I think there might be an old shirt you can wear. I will step outside while you change." "You will freeze out there," Eleanor protested through chattering teeth. "I will survive. You will not if you stay in wet clothes. Change, wrap yourself in the blankets, and then I will come back in. I promise I will not look." He left before she could argue further, closing the door behind him. Eleanor stood for a moment, then realized he was right. Her clothes were soaked through, and she was so cold she could barely feel her fingers. With numb hands, she began undoing the buttons of her traveling coat, then her dress. It was awkward and difficult, her fingers refusing to cooperate, but eventually she managed to strip down to her skin. She found the chest Henry had mentioned and pulled out a rough woolen blanket and a faded work shirt that smelled of soap and tobacco. She pulled on the shirt, which hung to her knees, then wrapped the blanket around herself, cocooning herself in its scratchy warmth. "You can come back in," she called, and Henry entered, keeping his eyes carefully averted. He was still in his wet clothes, and Eleanor felt a pang of guilt. "You need to change too," she said. "You are just as wet as I was." "I will be fine. Henry Fletcher, do not be stubborn. You just carried me across a raging river. The least I can do is turn my back while you change into dry clothes. There must be something here you can use." Henry looked like he wanted to argue, but another shiver ran through him, and he conceded. "All right, turn around." Eleanor turned to face the wall, listening to the rustle of fabric as Henry changed. She found herself acutely aware of every sound, her imagination filling in what she could not see, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the growing warmth from the stove. When he told her she could turn around, he was wearing dry trousers and a clean undershirt, his wet clothes draped over the backs of the chairs near the stove to dry. "Sit down before you fall down," Henry said, gesturing to one of the chairs. Eleanor obeyed, sinking onto the seat with relief. Henry pulled the other chair close to the stove and sat down as well, stretching his hands toward the warmth. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the patter of rain on the roof. "Thank you," Eleanor said finally. "What you did tonight, it was the bravest thing I have ever seen." Henry glanced at her, and in the firelight, his face was softer, more open. "Anyone would have done the same." "No, they would not have. Most people would have told me to wait until the water went down. Never mind that it would have been too late by then. You risked your life for me." "I could not just leave you there." He said it simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Besides, I know that river. I have crossed it in flood before. I knew we could make it. Where did you learn to be so fearless?" Henry smiled faintly. "I am not fearless. I was terrified the whole time. But my father always said that courage is not the absence of fear, it is acting in spite of it." His expression grew distant. "He was a good man. He died 5 years ago. Left me the ranch he had spent his whole life building. I have been working it ever since, trying to make him proud." "I am sure he would be," Eleanor said softly. "What you did tonight, that took real courage." They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence now, the kind that settles between people who have shared something significant. Eleanor studied Henry in the firelight, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the way his damp hair curled slightly at his neck, the careful way he moved, as if always aware of his own strength. He was handsome, she realized, though not in the polished way of city men. His was a rough, honest attractiveness, earned through hard work and decent character. "What were you doing out here?" Henry asked, breaking into her thoughts. "It is dangerous to travel alone, especially with the weather being so unpredictable. I was visiting my aunt. She has a homestead about 15 miles east of Salt Lake City. I go to see her every few weeks when I can. I am a school teacher in the city, and the school term has just ended for the summer, so I had planned to stay with her for a few days." Eleanor pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "I have made that trip dozens of times. I had no idea the river would be so high. This spring runoff has been worse than usual. We had heavy snow this winter, and now with the warm weather and all this rain, every river in the territory is flooding." Henry shook his head. "You were lucky. That bridge has stood for 15 years. If it had collapsed while you were on it instead of just before you reached it, you would have been swept away." Eleanor shuddered, not wanting to think about how close she had come to disaster. "Well, I am grateful that you happened to be there. What were you doing out here?" "Checking on cattle. I have grazing rights on some land north of the river, and I wanted to make sure none of my stock were in danger from the flooding. I was heading back to my ranch when I saw you." He met her eyes. "I guess it was Providence." Providence indeed. Eleanor found she could not look away from his gaze. There was something in his eyes, a warmth and sincerity that made her heart beat faster. She had known this man for less than an hour, and yet she felt more connected to him than to people she had known for years. Perhaps it was the intensity of what they had just survived together, or perhaps it was something deeper, something that defied logical explanation. "Are you warm enough?" Henry asked, and Eleanor realized she had stopped shivering. "Yes, much better, thank you." "You should eat something. You have had a shock, and food will help." Henry rose and went to the shelves, rummaging through the supplies stored there. He found some jerky hard biscuits and a tin of peaches. It was simple fare, but Eleanor's stomach growled at the sight of it. They ate together in the firelight, and as they did, they talked. Henry told her about his ranch, about the challenges of running it alone with just a few hired hands, about his dreams of expanding the herd and maybe one day having a real house instead of the small cabin he currently lived in. Eleanor found herself telling him about her life, too, about growing up in Illinois, about how she had always loved learning and teaching, about the satisfaction she found in watching her students grasp new concepts. She told him about the loneliness, too, about how being an independent woman in the West could be isolating, how she was respected but kept at a distance by many of the families in Salt Lake City. "That must be hard," Henry said quietly. "Being alone, I mean. I know something about that. After my father died, it was just me. I have ranch hands, but it is not the same as having family." "No, it is not," Eleanor agreed. She looked at him across the small table, at this man who seemed to understand her in a way that so few people did, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was too soon, too fast, too improbable. She had just met him, but there was no denying the connection she felt, electric and undeniable. The storm continued outside, rain drumming on the roof, and as the evening wore on, their conversation became more personal, more intimate. Henry told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, about how he still missed her after all these years. Eleanor confessed her fears that she would never find someone who would accept her independence, who would not try to change her into something more conventional. They talked about books and music, about God and the meaning of life, about their hopes for the future. And with every word, every shared confidence, the space between them seemed to shrink. It was late when Eleanor finally yawned, unable to hide her exhaustion any longer. The events of the day had caught up with her, and she was suddenly so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. "You need to sleep," Henry said, standing up. "Take the bunk. I will sleep in the chair." "Henry, no. You carried me across a river. You deserve the bed more than I do." "Eleanor, I am not going to argue about this. You are taking the bunk. I have slept in worse places than a chair, believe me." Too tired to protest further, Eleanor made her way to the narrow bunk and lay down, still wrapped in the blanket. The mattress was thin and the pillow lumpy, but it felt wonderful after everything she had been through. She watched as Henry settled into the chair, stretching his long legs out toward the stove. He looked uncomfortable, but he did not complain. "Henry," she called softly into the darkness. "Yes?" "Thank you for everything." "You are welcome, Eleanor. Now sleep. Tomorrow we will figure out how to get you back to Salt Lake City." Eleanor closed her eyes, but sleep did not come immediately. Her mind was too full of the day's events, of the terrifying moment on the bridge, of the strength of Henry's arms around her, of the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. She had come so close to dying today, and yet she had never felt more alive. And it was all because of the cowboy sleeping in the chair across the room, the man who had risked everything to save her. When she finally drifted off, it was with a smile on her lips and Henry Fletcher's name in her thoughts. Morning came with pale sunlight filtering through the single small window of the line shack. Eleanor woke slowly, disoriented for a moment, before the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up, pushing her hair out of her face, and looked around. Henry was not in the chair. For a moment panic seized her, irrational but intense, and then the door opened and he stepped inside, carrying an armful of wood. "Good morning," he said, smiling at her. "I hope I did not wake you. I was just getting more wood for the fire and checking on the horse." "What time is it?" Eleanor asked, trying to smooth down her hopelessly tangled hair. "A bit past dawn, I would guess. The storm has passed, but the river will still be high. We will need to wait a few hours before we can cross back safely." He set the wood down near the stove and began building up the fire. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected, given everything." Eleanor stood up, the blanket still wrapped around her, and went to the window. Outside, the world looked washed clean, the sky a brilliant blue after the previous day's gray. But when she looked toward the river, she could still see it rushing past, brown and swollen. How long do you think before it is safe to cross? By afternoon, if we are lucky, the water recedes quickly once the rain stops. Henry glanced at her. Are you all right? You are not hurt from yesterday? Just some bruises, nothing serious. You bore the worst of it, carrying me like that. Are you all right? I am fine. A little sore, maybe, but nothing that will not work itself out. He added more wood to the fire, then stood up, brushing off his hands. I found some coffee in a pot. Would you like some? That sounds wonderful. They fell into an easy routine, Henry preparing the coffee while Eleanor tidied up the blankets and tried to make herself more presentable. Her clothes from the night before were still damp but wearable, and she changed back into them behind the blanket that Henry gallantly held up for her privacy. When she emerged, her dress wrinkled and her hair in a hasty braid, she felt more like herself, even if she looked a mess. They drank their coffee sitting at the little table, and Eleanor found herself studying Henry again in the morning light. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had not slept well in the chair, but his smile was genuine when he caught her looking. What? He asked. I was just thinking that I am glad it was you who happened to be there yesterday. I do not think I could have been luckier in my rescuer. Henry's ears reddened slightly, and he looked down at his coffee. I am glad I was there too, although I wish you had never been in danger in the first place. Well, danger or not, it led to me meeting you, so perhaps there was some purpose in it. He looked up at that, his gray eyes searching hers, and Eleanor felt that electric connection again, that sense of something significant happening. Do you believe in fate, Eleanor? I do not know. I always thought I was too practical for such things. But after yesterday, I am beginning to wonder. What about you? My father used to say that God puts people in our path when we need them most. Maybe he was right. Henry reached across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, he took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and strong, and Eleanor felt a thrill run through her at the simple touch. I know we just met. I know this is all happening very fast. But I feel like I know you, Eleanor, like I have been waiting to meet you. Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. I feel that too, she whispered. I have never believed in love at first sight. I always thought it was something made up for novels. But this, what I am feeling right now, it is real. I know it is real. So do I. Henry stood up, still holding her hand, and drew her to her feet. They stood facing each other in the small shack, the morning sun painting golden patterns on the floor between them. Eleanor Jameson, I have known you for less than a day, and yet I cannot imagine letting you walk out of my life. Is that insane? If it is, then we are both insane together. Eleanor stepped closer, closing the distance between them, and looked up into his face. Henry, I do not know what this is or where it will lead, but I want to find out. I want to know you. I want to see where this feeling takes us. Henry raised his free hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with infinite tenderness. I want that too, more than I have wanted anything in a long time. They stood like that for a long moment, the air between them charged with possibility. Then, slowly, carefully, as if afraid she might disappear, Henry lowered his head and kissed her. It was soft and sweet and full of promise, and Eleanor felt herself melt into it, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. She could feel his heart beating beneath her palm, as rapid as her own, and knew that this moment was changing everything, that after this kiss, nothing would ever be quite the same. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Henry rested his forehead against hers. I have been wanting to do that since last night, he admitted. I have been wanting you to, Eleanor replied. And then they were both laughing, giddy with the newness of it all, with the wonder of finding each other in the most unlikely circumstances. They spent the rest of the morning talking more, learning about each other with the eagerness of people who knew they had found something precious. Henry told her about the ranch, about his favorite horse and his best cattle dog, about the spot on his property where the sunset was most beautiful. Eleanor told him about her students, about the little girl who had struggled with reading all year until something suddenly clicked and she had cried with joy, about the satisfaction of watching young minds grow and develop, They talked about their families, their histories, their dreams for the future, and with every story shared, every confidence exchanged, the bond between them grew stronger. By early afternoon, Henry declared that the river had receded enough to attempt a crossing. They gathered their things, such as they were, and Henry saddled his horse. Before they left, Eleanor took one last look around the little line shack. It was just a crude shelter, 4 walls and a roof, but it would always be special to her now. This was where she had fallen in love with Henry Fletcher, where her whole life had changed direction in the course of a single night. The ride to the river was quiet, Eleanor's arms wrapped around Henry's waist, her cheek resting against his back. When they reached the bank, she could see that the water had indeed gone down significantly, though it was still running higher and faster than normal. But the crossing Henry had indicated was passable now, the water only reaching the horse's chest at the deepest point. "It will be much easier this time," Henry assured her, and he was right. The crossing, while still nerve-wracking, was nothing like the terrifying ordeal of the night before. Within minutes, they were on the opposite bank, and Eleanor felt a surge of relief at being on the correct side of the river again. They rode to where Eleanor had left her wagon and horse, and found both still there, Rosie grazing peacefully as if nothing dramatic had happened. The wagon appeared undamaged, and after Henry checked it over, he declared it fit to travel. "I will escort you back to Salt Lake City," Henry said, as he hitched Rosie back to the wagon. "I do not want you traveling alone, not after yesterday." "You do not have to do that. I have already taken up so much of your time." Henry turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Eleanor, after everything that has happened, after what we talked about this morning, do you really think I am going to just let you drive away and hope I see you again? I am taking you home. Besides, I need to know where you live so I can come courting properly." The word courting sent a thrill through Eleanor's chest. "You want to court me? Unless you have changed your mind about wanting to see where this feeling takes us?" "I have not changed my mind," Eleanor said quickly. "I want that very much." "Good, then it is settled. I will take you home, and then, if you will allow it, I will come calling on you tomorrow evening." They set out together, Henry riding alongside the wagon as Eleanor drove. The journey to Salt Lake City took several hours, and they talked the whole way, reluctant to waste a single moment of silence when they could be learning more about each other. Eleanor found herself watching Henry as much as the road, admiring the easy way he sat his horse, the competent way he handled himself. He was so different from the few men who had attempted to court her before, stiff city men who had been put off by her independence and education. Henry seemed to appreciate those things about her, seemed to find them attractive rather than threatening. As they entered the outskirts of Salt Lake City, Eleanor felt a strange reluctance. She did not want this day to end, did not want to say goodbye to Henry, even though she knew she would see him again tomorrow. The city was bustling with afternoon activity, wagons and horses filling the streets, people going about their business. Eleanor directed Henry to the small house she rented on the east side of the city, a modest but comfortable place that suited her needs perfectly. When they arrived, Henry helped her down from the wagon and walked her to her door. They stood on her small porch, neither of them quite ready to part. "Tomorrow evening?" Henry asked, taking her hand. "Tomorrow evening," Eleanor confirmed. "I will make dinner, nothing fancy, but something better than jerky and biscuits." Henry laughed. "I look forward to it." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture that was both old-fashioned and utterly sincere. "Thank you, Eleanor, for trusting me yesterday, for letting me carry you across that river. I know it was improper and probably terrifying, but I am grateful for it. If that bridge had not washed out, I might never have met you." "I am grateful too," Eleanor said softly. "I will see you tomorrow, Henry." She watched as he mounted his horse and rode away, turning to wave at her once before he disappeared around the corner. Only then did Eleanor go inside, closing the door behind her and leaning against it with a sigh. Her house felt strange and empty after the closeness of the line shack, after the intensity of the last 24 hours. She looked down at herself, at her rumpled dress and muddy boots, and laughed. She must look like she had been through a disaster, which of course she had. But as she changed her clothes and began tidying up her house in preparation for Henry's visit the next day, Eleanor could not stop smiling. She had set out 2 days ago for a simple visit to her aunt, and had returned with something far more precious. She had found love in the most unexpected way, had been saved by a cowboy who carried her across a raging river on his back and somehow, in the process, had carried away her heart as well. The next day passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Eleanor cleaned her house from top to bottom, changed the linens on her furniture, and spent the afternoon preparing a proper meal. She made roasted chicken with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, and a berry pie from the preserves she had put up last summer. As she worked, she caught herself humming, something she had not done in years, and realized with a start that she was truly happy. Happy in a way she had not been since she was a child. When evening came and there was a knock on her door, Eleanor's heart leaped. She smoothed down her dress, a simple blue cotton that she had chosen with care, and opened the door to find Henry standing on her porch, hat in hand, looking nervous and handsome in clean clothes with his hair neatly combed. "Good evening," he said, his face breaking into a smile when he saw her. "You look beautiful." "Thank you. Come in, please." Eleanor stepped aside to let him enter, and Henry crossed the threshold, looking around with interest at her small home. She had decorated it simply but with care, with books lining the shelves and wildflowers in a vase on the table. "I hope you are hungry. I may have cooked too much." "It smells wonderful," Henry said, and Eleanor could see him visibly relaxing as he took in the warm, welcoming atmosphere she had created. "Can I help with anything?" They worked together to bring the food to the table, and then sat down to eat. The meal was delicious, if Eleanor said so herself, and Henry praised every bite with what seemed to be genuine enthusiasm. They talked easily throughout dinner, picking up the threads of conversations from the day before, discovering new things about each other. Eleanor learned that Henry loved to read, though he rarely had time for it anymore, and that his favorite book was a battered copy of Ivanhoe that had belonged to his father. Henry learned that Eleanor played the piano, though she did not own one and had to practice on the instrument at the school when she could. After dinner, they moved to the small sitting room, and Eleanor served coffee and pie. The evening light slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold, and Eleanor felt a contentment she had rarely known. This felt right, sitting here with Henry, talking and laughing, as if they had known each other for years instead of days. "I have been thinking about something," Henry said as they sat together on the sofa. A respectable distance between them, but close enough that Eleanor was intensely aware of his presence. "About what you said yesterday, about being lonely, about keeping people at a distance. I do not want you to do that with me, Eleanor. I want you to let me in. I want to know all of you, the parts you show the world and the parts you keep hidden." Eleanor set down her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. "That is not easy for me. I have spent so long being independent, being strong, not needing anyone. The idea of letting someone see all of me, it is frightening." "I know, it frightens me too." Henry reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "But I think some things are worth being frightened for. I think you are worth being frightened for." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. No one had ever wanted to know all of her, flaws and fears included. "I want to let you in, Henry. I want to try. I just need you to be patient with me." "I can be patient. I can be whatever you need me to be." He moved closer, closing the distance between them on the sofa. "Eleanor, I know this is happening fast. I know we should probably take more time, be more cautious, but life is uncertain. I learned that when my father died, when I saw that bridge wash out yesterday with you on the other side. We do not know how much time we have, any of us. So, when you find something real, something true, I think you have to hold on to it with both hands." "I think so too," Eleanor whispered. She reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "Henry, I am falling in love with you. I know it is too soon to say such a thing, but it is true. I am falling so fast it terrifies me." "I am falling too," Henry said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have been falling since the moment I saw you standing on that riverbank, looking so brave and determined. I think I fell in love with you when you climbed on my back without hesitation, trusting me with your life, and I know for certain I was in love with you by the time we reached the other side." Eleanor felt a tear slip down her cheek, and Henry brushed it away with his thumb. Then he was kissing her again, and this kiss was different from the one in the line shack. This one was deeper, more certain, full of promise and passion. Eleanor kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all of her feelings into it, all of her hope and joy and love. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Eleanor rested her head on Henry's shoulder, feeling his arms come around her, strong and safe. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the sun set outside and the room grew dim. They talked more, in soft voices, about their future, about how they would make this work. Henry told her about his ranch, about how it was a hard life but a good one, and how he would never ask her to give up teaching if she did not want to. Eleanor told him that she loved teaching, but that she had always dreamed of having a family too, of children of her own to love and raise. They talked about practical things and impossible dreams, and through it all, they held each other, neither willing to let go. It was late when Henry finally stood to leave, knowing that propriety demanded he not stay too long. Eleanor walked him to the door, reluctant to see him go. "When can I see you again?" Henry asked, taking both her hands in his. "I am free on Sunday. We could go for a ride if you would like. I could pack a picnic." "That sounds perfect." Henry kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, then her lips, each kiss soft and sweet. "Good night, Eleanor. Dream of me." "I will." "Good night, Henry." She watched him ride away into the night, then closed the door and leaned against it with a sigh. Her life had changed so completely in just 2 days that it was hard to believe. She had gone from being alone and resigned to her solitude to being in love and hopeful for a future she had never dared to imagine. All because a river had washed out a bridge and a cowboy had been brave enough to carry her across. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Eleanor's life. Henry came courting regularly, visiting her whenever he could spare the time from his ranch work. They went on rides together, exploring the countryside around Salt Lake City, and Eleanor packed picnics that they ate in meadows full of wildflowers or beside quiet streams. Henry took her to his ranch, a modest but well-maintained property with a small cabin, a barn, and extensive grazing land. Eleanor fell in love with it almost as much as she had fallen in love with Henry, seeing the potential in everything, imagining how it could grow and flourish. Henry met Eleanor's aunt, who declared him a fine young man and gave her blessing to their courtship with tears in her eyes, grateful that her niece had finally found someone worthy of her. Eleanor met Henry's ranch hands, gruff men who clearly respected their boss and who warmed to Eleanor when they saw how happy she made Henry. They talked about marriage, tentatively at first, and then with growing certainty. Henry wanted to marry her, wanted to make her his wife, wanted to build a life together. Eleanor wanted the same thing with an intensity that surprised her. She had always been so independent, so certain that she needed no one, but Henry had changed that. With him, she did not feel like she was losing her independence. She felt like she was gaining a partner, someone who would stand beside her, not in front of her or behind her, but right there at her side, facing whatever life brought them together. In August, 2 months after the river crossing that had brought them together, Henry proposed properly. He took Eleanor to his favorite spot on the ranch, a hill that overlooked the valley, where the sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. He got down on one knee and offered her a simple gold band that had been his mother's, telling her that she had made him happier than he had ever thought possible, and would she please do him the honor of becoming his wife. Eleanor said yes through happy tears, and Henry slipped the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. They kissed on that hilltop as the sun set around them, and Eleanor knew that this was the beginning of the rest of her life, the life she was meant to live. They were married in September, in a simple ceremony at the church in Salt Lake City. Eleanor wore a dress of ivory silk that she had sewn herself, and Henry wore his best suit, looking handsome and nervous as he waited for her at the altar. Her aunt was there, crying happy tears, and several of Eleanor's fellow teachers, and Henry's ranch hands, all scrubbed clean and uncomfortable in their best clothes. The ceremony was short but meaningful, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Henry kissed her, Eleanor felt like her heart might burst with joy. They held a small reception at Eleanor's house, which would soon become Henry's house too, until they could build something larger on the ranch. There was food and music and laughter, and Eleanor danced with her new husband, feeling like she was floating. This was real. This was happening. She was Mrs. Eleanor Fletcher now, wife of the bravest, kindest man she had ever known. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, filled with nervous laughter and gentle exploration. Henry was patient and loving, making sure Eleanor felt safe and cherished, and when they finally came together as husband and wife, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, the culmination of everything they felt for each other. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, and Eleanor traced lazy patterns on Henry's chest with her fingertips. "Are you happy?" Henry asked, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Eleanor replied honestly. "You have given me everything I never knew I wanted. You have done the same for me. Before I met you, I was just going through the motions, working the ranch, existing but not really living. You changed all of that. You made me feel alive again." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, and Eleanor's last thought before sleep claimed her was that she was home, not in a building or a place, but with Henry. Wherever he was, that was home. Eleanor continued teaching through the fall, though she and Henry discussed whether she would continue after the school year ended. They both wanted children, and they knew that would make teaching more difficult, though not impossible. For now, Eleanor enjoyed her students and Henry supported her completely, even helping her grade papers in the evenings sometimes. His brow furrowed in concentration as he read through children's essays on topics like the importance of honesty and what they did on their summer holidays. Life on the ranch was an adjustment for Eleanor. She had lived in town for years, and the isolation of ranch life took some getting used to. But Henry made it easier. He taught her to ride better, to rope cattle, to help with the endless tasks that ranch life demanded. Eleanor learned to cook on a wood stove, to bake bread that did not turn out like rocks, to can vegetables and put up preserves for the winter. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and hard work and simple pleasures. In return, Eleanor brought culture and learning to Henry's life. She read to him in the evenings from her extensive book collection, everything from Shakespeare to recent novels. She taught him to dance properly, turning their small cabin into a ballroom, laughing as they waltzed around the furniture. She challenged him intellectually, debating politics and philosophy with him, and Henry discovered that he loved the way her mind worked, quick and curious, and always questioning. They worked on improving the ranch together, planning for the future. Henry wanted to expand the cattle operation, and Eleanor helped him work out the finances, figuring out how many head they could afford to buy and what their profit margins might be. They talked about building a real house, something bigger than the cabin, with multiple rooms and a proper kitchen, and maybe even a piano so Eleanor could play again. They sketched out plans on scraps of paper, dreaming together. Winter came, and with it, the isolation that came from being snowed in for days at a time. But Eleanor found she did not mind. She and Henry were cocooned in their little cabin, warm and safe while the wind howled outside. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading and talking and making love, and Eleanor thought she had never been more content. This was what marriage was supposed to be, this partnership and companionship and love. In February, Eleanor began to suspect she might be pregnant. She said nothing at first, waiting to be sure, but when her monthly courses did not come and she began feeling nauseated in the mornings, she knew. She told Henry on a cold evening, the two of them sitting by the fire after dinner. She had been nervous about how he would react, worried that it was too soon, that they were not ready. But Henry's face had lit up with such joy that all her fears melted away. "A baby?" he had said, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby?" "Yes," Eleanor had confirmed, laughing and crying at the same time. "In late summer, I think. Are you happy?" "Happy?" Henry had pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Eleanor, I am more than happy. I am overjoyed. We are going to be parents. We are going to have a family." They held each other for a long time, both of them overwhelmed by the enormity of it. A child? Their child? It was terrifying and wonderful and absolutely perfect. Eleanor stopped teaching at the end of the school year as her pregnancy became more obvious, and the physical demands of teaching became too much. She missed her students, but she was excited about this new chapter of her life. She spent her days preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, setting up a cradle that Henry had built with his own hands. Her aunt came to visit often, bringing supplies and advice, and Eleanor was grateful for her presence and wisdom. Henry was attentive and protective throughout her pregnancy, perhaps overly so. He worried constantly, afraid that something would go wrong, that he would lose her, or the baby, or both. Eleanor reassured him as best she could, but she understood his fears. Childbirth was dangerous, especially out on an isolated ranch far from doctors. But she had to believe that everything would be all right, that this child they had created out of love would come into the world safely. In late August, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Eleanor went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth, lasting through the night and into the next day. Henry stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement even when Eleanor was too exhausted to respond. Her aunt was there too, acting as midwife, her experienced hands guiding the baby into the world. When Eleanor heard the first cry of her child, she burst into tears of relief and joy. "It is a boy," her aunt announced, placing the squalling infant on Eleanor's chest. "A healthy boy." Eleanor looked down at her son, at his red face and tiny fists and dark hair, and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. This was her child, hers and Henry's, a living symbol of their love. She looked up at Henry, who was staring at the baby with an expression of absolute wonder, tears streaming down his face. "We have a son," Eleanor whispered. "We have a son," Henry repeated, his voice choked with emotion. He reached out a tentative finger, and the baby immediately grabbed hold of it, his tiny hand wrapping around Henry's calloused finger. Henry laughed, a sound that was half sob. "Hello there, little one. I am your father, and I promise you I am going to do everything in my power to give you a good life." They named him James, after Henry's father, with the middle name Thomas, after Eleanor's father. Little James Fletcher was a fussy baby at first, crying often and sleeping little, but Eleanor and Henry did not mind. They were too enchanted with him, too grateful for his existence. Henry proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with James when he would not sleep, changing his diapers without complaint, singing to him in a surprisingly good baritone voice. Life with a baby was exhausting and chaotic and absolutely wonderful. Eleanor had never been so tired in her life, but she had also never been happier. Watching Henry with their son, seeing the gentleness with which he handled the tiny infant, made her fall in love with her husband all over again. This was the life she had been meant for, she realized. Not just teaching, not just independence, but this, family and love and partnership. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. James grew into a sturdy toddler, then a curious little boy who followed his father everywhere, wanting to help with ranch work, even though he was far too small. When James was 3, Eleanor became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Lucy. Lucy was easier than James had been, a placid baby who slept well and smiled often. James was fascinated by his little sister, always wanting to hold her and help care for her. And Eleanor's heart swelled watching her children together. The ranch prospered under Henry's careful management and Eleanor's financial planning. They expanded the cattle operation, bought more land, and finally built the house they had dreamed of, a spacious structure with multiple bedrooms, a large kitchen, and yes, a parlor with room for a piano. Henry bought Eleanor a beautiful upright piano for their 5th anniversary, and Eleanor cried when she played it for the first time, the music filling their home with beauty. 2 more children followed, another boy they named Robert, and a final daughter, Sarah. Eleanor's pregnancies became routine, though Henry never stopped worrying, and their home filled with the noise and chaos and joy of a large family. The children grew up surrounded by love, learning to ride almost before they could walk, helping with ranch chores as soon as they were able, and listening to their mother read to them every evening from her seemingly endless supply of books. Eleanor sometimes thought back to that day at the river, to the terror she had felt when the bridge washed out, to the moment when Henry had appeared on the opposite bank like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. That day had changed everything. That moment when she had climbed onto his back and wrapped her arms around his shoulders, trusting him with her life, had been the beginning of all of this. Every good thing in her life now could be traced back to that river, to that cowboy who had been brave enough to carry her across. She told her children the story sometimes, on evenings when they begged for tales of how she and their father had met. She would describe the raging water, the terrifying crossing, the night in the line shack where she had first fallen in love. The children loved the story, wide-eyed at the drama of it, and James, the eldest, always said that when he grew up, he wanted to be as brave as his father. Henry would laugh and ruffle James's hair, saying that he hoped his son would never have to carry anyone across a flooded river, but if he did, Henry hoped he would be brave enough to do it. Then he would meet Eleanor's eyes across the room, and the look they shared said everything. They had been so lucky to find each other, so blessed to have built this life together. As the children grew older and more independent, Eleanor sometimes thought about returning to teaching. She missed it, missed the intellectual stimulation and the satisfaction of watching young minds develop. Henry encouraged her to do whatever made her happy, and when their youngest, Sarah, was old enough for school, Eleanor began teaching again, this time at a small school much closer to the ranch. She only taught 3 days a week, which gave her time for her family, but also allowed her to pursue her passion. It was the perfect balance, and Eleanor felt fulfilled in a way she never had before. The years continued to pass, marked by the usual milestones and challenges of life. There were good years when the cattle prices were high and the weather cooperative, and there were hard years when they struggled to make ends meet. There were moments of joy, like when James graduated from school at the top of his class, or when Lucy played her first piano recital, or when Robert caught his first fish, or when Sarah said her first word. There were moments of sorrow, too, when Eleanor's beloved aunt passed away peacefully in her sleep, or when they lost cattle to a harsh winter, or when Henry broke his arm in a riding accident and was laid up for weeks. Through it all, Eleanor and Henry faced everything together, their love deepening with each passing year. They celebrated their 10th anniversary, then their 20th, then their 25th. Their children grew up and began making their own ways in the world. James took over much of the ranch work, proving himself to be as capable and hard-working as his father. Lucy married a nice young man from town and moved to Salt Lake City, where she taught music. Robert announced his intention to become a veterinarian and left to study in the East. Sarah, the baby, was still at home, 17 and full of dreams and plans. On a warm evening in late spring, 30 years after the river crossing that had brought them together, Eleanor and Henry sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. They were in their 50s now, their hair touched with gray, their faces lined with the marks of a life well lived. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people they had been, standing on opposite banks of a raging river, making a choice that would change everything. "Do you remember," Eleanor said, taking Henry's hand, "when you said that courage is acting despite fear? I remember. It is something my father told me, and I have tried to live by it." "You have lived by it. You showed such courage that day, Henry. You risked your life for a stranger, and you changed my life forever." Henry raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, just as he had on that first evening when he had walked her to her door. "Marrying you was the best decision I ever made, Eleanor. Every good thing in my life has come from that choice." "I feel the same way. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if that bridge had not washed out, if we had never met. I hate thinking about it, because it means imagining a life without you, without our children, without all of this." She gestured at the ranch spread out before them, at the home they had built together. "We were meant to find each other," Henry said firmly. "I have to believe that. Whether it was fate or providence or just incredible luck, we were meant to be together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. From inside the house, they could hear Sarah playing the piano, the music drifting out through the open windows. The sound was beautiful, filled with all the emotion and passion of youth, and Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "We have built a good life," she said softly. "The best life," Henry agreed. "And it is not over yet. We have years ahead of us still, God willing. Years to watch our grandchildren grow, years to enjoy each other, years to keep building on what we have started." Eleanor leaned her head on Henry's shoulder, feeling his arm come around her, and thought about all the years they had shared, all the moments both big and small that had made up their marriage. The laughter and tears, the struggles and triumphs, the everyday mundane tasks and the extraordinary experiences, all of it woven together into a life that was rich and full and deeply meaningful. "I love you, Henry Fletcher," she said. "I have loved you since the moment you carried me across that river, and I will love you until the day I die. And I love you, Eleanor Fletcher. You are my heart, my partner, my greatest blessing. Carrying you across that river was the easy part. Building this life with you, that has been the real adventure." They kissed then, a soft, lingering kiss that held 30 years of love and commitment, and Eleanor felt the same flutter in her stomach that she had felt as a young woman of 23, falling in love with a brave cowboy who had risked everything to save her. Some things, she realized, never changed. The intensity might mellow with time, the passion might evolve into something deeper and more complex, but the love remained constant and true. As the stars multiplied in the sky above them and the night grew cool, Henry and Eleanor remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, grateful for every moment they had been given, for every challenge they had faced together, for every joy they had shared. Their story had begun with a washed-out bridge and a desperate river crossing, but it had grown into something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of courage, love, and the simple act of trusting another person with your life. Inside, Sarah finished her piece and called out to them, asking if they wanted tea before bed. Eleanor called back that they would be in shortly, and Henry helped her to her feet. They stood for a moment longer, looking out at the land they had worked so hard to build, at the home that held all their memories and dreams. Then, hand in hand, they walked inside together, ready to face whatever the rest of their lives might bring, secure in the knowledge that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. The years that followed continued to bring both joys and challenges, but Eleanor and Henry faced them all with the same partnership and love that had sustained them since that fateful day at the river. James married a lovely woman and gave them grandchildren, sturdy little boys and girls who loved to visit the ranch and hear stories about their grandparents. Lucy had children too, talented and bright, and she brought them to visit often, filling the house with music and laughter. Robert completed his studies and returned to Utah, opening a veterinary practice that served ranchers throughout the territory. Sarah eventually married as well, choosing a school teacher like her mother, and they built a home not far from the ranch, allowing Eleanor and Henry to watch their youngest daughter flourish. Eleanor continued teaching part-time, well into her 60s, finally retiring only when her energy began to wane. She missed the classroom, but she found new purpose in spending time with her grandchildren, teaching them to read and instilling in them the same love of learning that had defined her own life. Henry worked the ranch as long as he was able, finally turning most of the day-to-day operations over to James when the physical demands became too much. But he still rode out every morning to check on things, unable to completely let go of the land he had spent his life building. They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by their children and grandchildren, a raucous gathering that filled the house to bursting. Eleanor looked around at all the faces, at the family she and Henry had created, and felt overwhelming gratitude. This was their legacy, not just the ranch or the land, but these people, these relationships, this love that would continue long after she and Henry were gone. On their 50th anniversary, the celebration was quieter, but no less meaningful. Their children arranged a renewal of vows ceremony, and Eleanor and Henry stood once again before a minister, speaking the same promises they had made 50 years earlier. Eleanor was 73 now, Henry 75, and they both moved more slowly, spoke more softly, but the love in their eyes was as bright as it had been on their wedding day. "I, Henry, take you, Eleanor, to be my wife," Henry said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Just as I did 50 years ago, just as I would every day for the rest of my life. You are my everything." "I, Eleanor, take you, Henry, to be my husband," Eleanor replied, tears streaming down her face. "You saved my life when you carried me across that river, but you did so much more than that. You gave me a life worth living. Thank you for 50 beautiful years." They kissed to the sound of applause and cheers from their family, and Eleanor felt like a young woman again, full of hope and possibility. This was what love looked like after 50 years, she thought. Not the breathless passion of youth, though there was still passion, but something deeper and more profound. It was knowing someone completely and loving them anyway. It was facing hardship together and coming out stronger. It was building something lasting, something that would endure. Henry lived to be 81, still sharp in mind if not in body, still devoted to Eleanor and their family. He passed away peacefully one winter evening, Eleanor holding his hand, their children gathered around his bed. His last words were for her. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything. For saying yes when I asked you to climb on my back, for trusting me, for building this life with me. I have been so blessed." "I am the one who has been blessed," Eleanor replied, tears streaming down her face. "I love you, Henry. I will always love you." He smiled at her one last time, squeezed her hand, and then he was gone, slipping away as gently as a sigh. Eleanor felt like a part of her had been torn away, like she could not breathe, could not think, could not imagine a world without Henry Fletcher in it. But she was surrounded by her children, by the tangible evidence of the life she and Henry had built together, and she drew strength from that. Eleanor lived for another 5 years after Henry's death, surrounded by family, kept busy with grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She spoke often of Henry, keeping his memory alive, telling anyone who would listen about the brave cowboy who had carried her across a raging river and had won her heart in the process. She visited his grave every week, placing wildflowers on the headstone, telling him about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch that James was running so well, about the world that kept changing around her. On a sunny morning in late spring, exactly 55 years after that fateful river crossing, Eleanor passed away in her sleep, peacefully and without pain. Her family mourned her deeply, but they took comfort in knowing that she had lived a long, full life, and that she was finally reunited with the love of her life. They buried her next to Henry, under the big oak tree on the hill where he had proposed all those years ago. The gravestone was simple, bearing both their names and dates, and beneath that, an inscription that James had chosen: across the river and into forever, together, always. The story of Eleanor and Henry became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. Their great-grandchildren grew up hearing about the washed-out bridge, the terrifying crossing, the love that had blossomed from an act of courage and desperation. The story changed slightly with each telling, embellished and romanticized, but the core remained true. A woman stranded, a cowboy who saved her by carrying her across a river on his back, and a love that had lasted a lifetime. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through the generations, a living testament to what Henry and Eleanor had built. The house they had constructed still stood, updated and modernized, but fundamentally unchanged, and family members still gathered there for holidays and celebrations. In the parlor hung a portrait of Henry and Eleanor, painted on their 25th anniversary. In it, they were middle-aged, their faces showing the marks of hard work and time, but their eyes were bright and their expressions serene. Anyone who looked at that portrait could see the love between them, could sense the depth of their connection. And in the end, that was their greatest legacy. Not the ranch, not the land, not even their children and grandchildren, though all of those were important. Their greatest legacy was the example they had set, the proof that true love existed, that it was worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. They had shown that courage could be found in the most unlikely places, that sometimes the most terrifying moment of your life could be the beginning of the most beautiful chapter. Their story reminded everyone who heard it that life was unpredictable, that bridges could wash out and rivers could rage, but that in the midst of chaos and fear, there was always the possibility of finding something extraordinary. All you had to do was be brave enough to hold on, to trust, to take that leap of faith. Eleanor had been stranded when the river washed out the bridge. The cowboy had carried her across on his back, and from that single act of bravery and compassion had grown a love story that would be remembered and treasured for generations. A testament to the enduring power of the human heart, and the extraordinary things that could happen when two souls found each other at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place. The wildflowers still grew on that hill where they were buried, blooming every spring in a riot of color, as if the land itself was celebrating the love that had been lived there, the life that had been built there. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, if you stood very still and listened carefully, you could almost hear the echo of their laughter, the whisper of their voices, the enduring promise they had made to each other so many years ago to love and cherish, to stand together through whatever life brought, until death and beyond. Their story was complete, their circle closed, their love immortalized not just in family legend, but in the very fabric of the land they had worked and the lives they had touched. Henry and Eleanor Fletcher had lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind something beautiful and lasting. And in the end, that was all anyone could hope for, to be remembered not for grand achievements or wealth accumulated, but for the love they had given and received, for the family they had nurtured, for the example they had set of what a life well lived could look like. The river that had brought them together still flowed, though the bridge had long since been rebuilt and reinforced, But every time someone from the family crossed that river, they thought of Eleanor and Henry, of courage and love, and the extraordinary way their story had begun. And they were grateful, grateful for the legacy left to them, grateful for the reminder that sometimes the most terrifying moments could lead to the most beautiful outcomes, grateful that their family existed because one brave cowboy had been willing to carry a stranded woman across a raging river on his back, and in doing so had found the love of his life.